Brian May just revealed the heartbreaking truth about Freddie Mercury's final days. There are moments in music history that feel almost too heavy to carry, stories that go beyond fame and talent, and instead reveal something deeply human. One of those stories is the final chapter of Freddie Mercury's life, told not through headlines or speculation, but through the quiet memories of someone who stood beside him until the very end. Brian May, Queen's legendary guitarist, has spoken over the years about those last days, and what he describes is not just the story of a dying rock star, but of a man holding on to dignity, courage, and friendship in the face of something he could not escape. By the early 1990s, Freddie Mercury's health had become a closely guarded secret. Rumors had circulated for years, but within Queen, the truth was undeniable. Freddie was seriously ill, yet he refused to let that define him. According to Brian May, what stood out most during that time was Freddie's determination to keep working. Even as his body weakened, his spirit remained relentless. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want the world to see him as fragile. What he wanted was to create. Brian recalls how Freddie would come into the studio, already physically exhausted. Yet once the music began, something changed. It was as if he could temporarily step outside his illness. His voice, though affected, still carried that unmistakable power and emotion. They knew time was limited, but they never spoke about it directly in a heavy way. Instead, they focused on what they could still do together. Freddie had a sense of urgency, but it wasn't panic. It was purpose. He wanted to leave behind as much music as possible. Songs like "The Show Must Go On" became more than just recordings. They became statements. Brian has shared how difficult it was to watch Freddie push himself so hard, especially when it was clear how much pain he was in. There were moments when Brian doubted whether Freddie could even stand long enough to record. One particular memory has stayed with him. While working on "The Show Must Go On," Brian was unsure if Freddie would be able to sing the demanding vocals. He expressed his concern gently, not wanting to push too far. Freddie's response was simple, but powerful. He said, "I'll do it, darling." Then he stepped into the studio, poured himself a vodka, and delivered one of the most iconic performances in rock history. To Brian, that moment defined Freddie. It wasn't just about talent. It was about sheer will. Even as his body was failing him, his identity as an artist never faded. He refused to be reduced to his illness. Instead, he chose to keep giving. Outside of the studio, things were different. Brian has spoken about visiting Freddie at home during those final months. The energy that Freddie once carried on stage was no longer there in the same way. There were quieter moments, more reflective, more fragile. Yet even then, Freddie maintained a sense of humor. He would joke, laugh, and try to make others feel comfortable, even when he was the one suffering. There was a kind of unspoken understanding among the band members. They knew what was happening, but they didn't dwell on it. Freddie didn't want that. He wanted normalcy as much as possible. Conversations would drift between music, memories, and everyday things. It was their way of preserving something real, something human in a situation that could easily have been overwhelming. Brian has admitted that those visits were emotionally difficult. Watching a close friend go through such a decline is something that leaves a permanent mark. But at the same time, he felt privileged to be there, to witness Freddie's strength, not as a performer, but as a person. Freddie's final days were marked by increasing weakness. The illness had progressed to a point where even simple movements became exhausting. Yet he remained mentally sharp, fully aware of everything around him. He chose to stay in his home, surrounded by familiar things, rather than in a hospital environment. Brian remembers the atmosphere as both heavy and strangely peaceful. There was sadness, of course, but there was also a sense of acceptance. Freddie had reached a point where he understood what was coming, and he faced it in his own way. Not with fear that he showed outwardly, but with a quiet kind of courage. Of the most touching aspects Brian has shared is how Freddie never wanted to burden others. Even when he was clearly in pain, he would try to minimize it, often brushing it off or changing the subject. It was as if he was protecting the people around him from the full weight of what he was going through. As the end drew closer, Freddie became more withdrawn physically, but not emotionally. The connections he had with those closest to him remained strong. Brian has described those last interactions as deeply meaningful, even if they were simple. Sometimes it was just sitting together, talking softly, or even sharing silence. What stands out in Brian May's recollections is not just the tragedy of losing Freddie Mercury, but the way Freddie chose to live until the very end. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand final speech. Instead, there was music, friendship, and an unwavering sense of self. And as those final days unfolded, Brian began to understand something profound. Freddie wasn't just saying goodbye in words. He was saying it through everything he had left behind, through the songs, the performances, and the moments they shared together. In the final stretch of Freddie Mercury's life, time seemed to move differently for those around him. Days felt heavier, quieter, and more significant. Brian May has often reflected on how every visit, every conversation, carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Yet, despite that, Freddie never allowed the atmosphere to become entirely consumed by sadness. There was still laughter in that house, still warmth, still the unmistakable presence of the man who had once commanded stadiums filled with thousands of people. But now, that presence was contained within a much smaller space, shared only with a few close individuals who understood what was happening. Brian has described how Freddie became more physically fragile, to the point where even walking required effort. But what never faded was his awareness. He remained engaged, listening carefully, responding thoughtfully. He was still Freddie, just in a different form. One of the most emotional realizations for Brian was seeing how Freddie handled his own mortality. There was no visible anger, no outward resentment. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. That doesn't mean he wasn't struggling, but he chose not to let that struggle define his final moments. Freddie had always been a private person when it came to personal matters, and that didn't change. Even in his last days, he maintained control over how much he revealed. Brian respected that deeply. There was an understanding that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. As the end approached, Freddie's world became smaller, more intimate. The grand stages and bright lights were replaced by familiar rooms and close companionship. Yet, in many ways, those moments held more depth than any performance. Brian has shared that one of the hardest parts was knowing that there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. For someone who had spent years creating, building, and performing, being in a situation where he could only watch was incredibly difficult. But what he could do was be present. and that, in itself, became meaningful. There were moments of silence that said more than words ever could. Sitting beside Freddie, simply being there, became an act of support. There was no need for constant conversation. Sometimes just sharing the same space was enough.